All right, well, welcome to week 4. This is lecture 3, and this is on the back side of the previous 2 lectures in which we talked about the kinds of questions we need to ask in this new missional era. Basically, what we've assumed thus far is that missional leadership matters. Leadership matters, moving people from one place to the place in which God would have them be matters. But in leaning into this post-Christian context, this new missional era, we recognize there's some questions that we need to ask on the front end to even help us to think about what kind of leader is going to be required as we move into this new landscape, this new horizon that awaits us, that's before us. And this is probably one of the places that I find the greatest encouragement in terms of this new missional centrifugal leadership. So I think at times we bought into certain models and molds about what leadership should look like. It sort of looks like that strong hierarchical CEO kind of leader, the leader who stands above and can sort of determine and dictate the actions and the movements of the people. The one who sort of goes up on the hilltop, gets the vision from God, comes down, reports it to everyone else, and they all fall in line and they follow that vision. I think that's kind of the vision, the mission, the model and the mold that many of us assumed was necessary to be a strong and efficient leader. And that's born of a certain era, right? Where we sort of believed that the world was sort of mechanistic, right? So it operated according to these natural laws. And if we could just figure out how the world worked or how people worked or how to move and operate organizations according to the systems that we designed, and you had someone smart enough, strong enough, wise enough, capable enough to manipulate or control the outcomes based upon the perceived expectations, whether it's by scientific data or statistical data or the predictions that we have based upon the natural laws or the ways in which things work in this world, then we can have success as an organization. So let me try to say that again in a way where I'm a little slower and trying to break that down. There was this perceived sense that the world worked a certain way, had a certain set of laws. The world was mechanistic, right? It was like a big mechanism that if you could figure out the laws and how the world worked, sociologically, anthropologically, economically, and you were able to understand how to implement systems that leverage these laws, then you could predict outcomes and that you could move an organization to reach those outcomes. And that the leader, the hierarchical leader, was the one who stood on top of the organization, who had the wisdom, the capacity, the charisma to be able to move a group of people according to the predictions of what would make them successful, leveraging what the people that they were leading brought to the table to fulfill the set of outcomes, predicted, almost inevitable outcomes, that if you follow these systems, these mechanisms, these methods, you will get these outcomes. We see this happen in the corporate world where people go to school to learn systems so that they can get the same kind of outcomes as the leaders who led those original systems received. We did this in the church. We bought into this model within the church growth movement in which if you could create the right kinds of systems with the right kinds of methods, with the right kind of leader, you could get the right kind of outcomes. How many pastors have filled up binders full of information at conferences trying to lead into someone else's shoes based upon their level of competence, their charisma, their wisdom, and their belief that they were able to construct systems to get a desired set of outcomes. And how many people have been frustrated that even though they put in all of those methods and those systems, still didn't get the outcomes that they had hoped for? So that was based upon a worldview, a sense that this world is nothing more than a mechanism to be discerned and discovered, organized well, structured well, so that you can get the outcomes that you desired. And everything in that world is hierarchical, right? So you have the leader who stands at the top, and those second tier leaders underneath them, and we build that sort of block down leadership model where everything comes from the top. The ideas come from the top. The vision comes from the top. The strategy comes from the top, and that stuff is disseminated down to everyone else, who then fulfills the expectations or fulfills the directives or fulfills the mandates of the people on top. And it seemed like it required a certain kind of leader, a person who had a certain form of charisma or strength or capacity, the one who could read all the latest managerial books or CEO books, and be able to leverage the strengths and the capabilities of the organization to move the organization towards success. That's a mold and model that many of us have witnessed and seen and recognized as probably the default within the world in which we live. And honestly, in many churches, that's what they think they're looking for. They think they're looking for that kind of leader, the leader who can step in, who can organize the organization, and who can give direction from the top so that everybody else knows what direction to go. Now, that is the assumptions of the world in which we've been in. And yet, what fascinates me, and I used to assign a book for this class called The Starfish and the Spider, which is it's a business book, but I really found great help from that book, because it helped me re-envision sort of the kind of language and terminology that I would use in terms of the shift that we've experienced. So there once was this sort of Lee Iacocca model, right, where you just that strong leader stands on top and reinvigorates an organization, reforms an organization, and moves them towards a greater level of success. But what we found is that things aren't as predictable, that the world isn't as mechanistic, that there are forms of chaos and uncertainty that enter into this picture. And besides, we now live in a world where people aren't eager to just sign up to work for someone who's going to dictate, mandate, and determine every action. They want to feel as though their contribution matters, the wisdom and that they have as a part of the organization matters. So you're seeing even across the board places like Google and some of these tech giants who stand out on the edge, who leverage people's gifts and capabilities and competencies in a far different way. They've sort of leveled out or flattened the hierarchical structure. It's not that someone doesn't lead or that someone doesn't have to make decisions. It's just that the very means by which that happens is different according to the way of the organization. And in The Starfish and the Spider, it uses two different images. This idea that if you cut the head off of a spider, right, it's dead, it's done. And if you cut off legs, it can't go very far. But with the starfish, when you divide it up, what happens is you end up with other starfish. They actually grow more starfish, right? And so what he's suggesting is that organizations in this new era need to look more like starfish and less like spiders. This idea that we need to flatten out our hierarchy, empower our people, multiply their gifts and capacities and capabilities, and to re-envision what leadership looks like. Leadership isn't simply just the one who stands above or stands on top and determines and dictates, mandates what everybody else does, but the one who comes along, collaborates with, empowers, helps give voice to those who have ideas and capacities and capabilities that under other forms of diminishing leadership or hierarchical leadership would have been unvalued. And what I want to suggest to us here is that we're moving into an era of leadership missionally in which the hierarchical structure just doesn't seem to hold the same promise as it might have at one time in one season. And in fact, I think just even the failures of what we've seen of the people who have tried to implement systems and structures based upon the wisdom of gurus who gave binders full of, if you just do these steps, you'll get this outcome, calls into question that model altogether. So what we want to do is we want to re-envision the kind of model of ministry leadership that might be necessary in this new era. And so we're going to move out of that sort of hierarchical structure, the one who comes down off the mountain with the vision, the one who gives the directives that everybody follows. But instead, if we could turn that model on its side, and the one who instead of stands above but stands alongside and helps breathe life into the organization by empowering other people to fulfill their gifts and graces, by multiplying across the board people's involvement and leveraging their passions and their willingness to be involved in the mission of God. And even the way in which we talk about vision, vision doesn't simply happen from the life of a specific person, but maybe even happens collaboratively amongst a group of people who together buy into or pray through or experience or get a sense of what God may be doing in our midst, that we need together join together. And then that person who is the leader is the one who has a unique role within the community, but not as one who stands above the community as though they're better than the community, though the community is completely dependent upon them, but the one who in this unique role stands with the community to empower the community to be a better version of itself as it lives out its gifts and graces. And I think we see evidence of this throughout the scriptures that we're going to talk about just a few key examples of. But for me, I want us to think about reframing our mental image of mission and ministry, because my guess is that some of you, even the idea of stepping into a leadership role, like a lead pastor role or being a church planter, comes filled with these ideas. Am I the kind of person who has the charisma, the capacity, the wisdom to stand and get everybody to do what I want them to do? And if you're not that kind of person, this may be the season of life that you find yourself going, maybe this is for me, because I don't necessarily see myself as a top-down kind of leader, but I can stand alongside of people and empower them and encourage them together as we collaboratively discern the vision of God to fulfill the purposes and passions that God has for each one of us in his ongoing, broader, bigger redemptive vision that we're a part of. And so that's the kind of leadership that we're going to talk about towards the end of today, and also into next week. And so, and one, I think one clear example of this, and then I'm going to look at Nehemiah in lecture 4, but I think one clear example of this would be maybe Moses, right? This idea that Moses is not the kind of person that you would anticipate being this hierarchical leader. He'd given his hand at that at one point, and then it driven him out into the wilderness for about 40 years. And when he comes back into it, he comes as one fairly reluctant, and immediately seeks someone to come alongside him, and his brother Aaron, and God gifts him that person who will stand with him. But even then, there's one time in which Moses did sort of lean into that person who was like in charge of it all, and it took a Jethro to come into his life and say, "Why are you trying to dictate and determine everything that happens? This can't thrive. This can't be like this. You've got to be able to empower and delegate and empower other people to live out their gifts and graces for the sake of the community." And so there's this sense that Moses at times doesn't fulfill even that mental image of the mold and model of this hierarchical, deterministic leader that we might anticipate or expect to see as someone who's going to lead the people out of Egypt. So we need to rethink our vision, our ministry models of leadership as we move forward through and into this next set of weeks moving forward. And I hope that this just gives you a brief picture of what will hopefully become clear as we move through the next 2 weeks.